first, Sakura Wars is a fantastic game, let alone one of the best within the Sega Saturn's library. Its visuals, music, story, characters, and tactical gameplay all come together in a way that hasn't aged a day, meaning we had to keep this thing accessible for future generations. Well, future Japanese generations anyway. The rest of the world doesn't need this game, am I right, guys? I am, of course, being facetious and a little bit petty, but regarding the series' localization history, or lack thereof, it turns out the Japan exclusivity didn't just bother non-Japanese players, it also bothered many of the team members themselves. Behind the scenes, there was a considerable amount of push to release these games in other regions, but the higher-ups at Sega were hesitant to provide the resources in order to make this possible. And I know that a lot of people on this platform love to villainize the company for decisions like these, but it's important to have a complete understanding of why this was done. RPGs were somewhat on the come-up by 1996, but still fairly niche all things considered, with dating sims arguably being even more niche, and visual novels undoubtedly being the most niche. Mesh them all together and you've got something that was made for a very specific audience, and all things considered, it's a miracle this game performed as well as it did just in Japan. A miracle the company definitely needed, because this ended up being one of the most expensive games they developed at the time. Combine all of this with the Sega Saturn's low sales everywhere outside of its home territory and ask yourself, do you really think it would have been smart to localize this game at the time? It was way too big a risk, and all signs were pointing to it being a bad idea and loss in revenue, the last thing Sega needed at the time. I too wish we lived in the timeline where the rest of the world was ready for an RPG mixed with social simulator elements, but we'd have to wait a few years before that became the norm, meaning Sakura Wars was yet another example of Sega being too ahead of the game for their own good, something fans of the company are very much used to at this point. But hey, so long as the games keep selling in Japan, at least they'd be able to have a new Sega IP to enjoy for years to come. Right? Well, yes, but that's the thing. The games were starting to fall in sales numbers when in the only region they were available. It seemed as if players were starting to move on from Sakura Wars come to Dreamcast titles regardless of their quality, and the franchise was in danger of death by obscurity. But you know what? Maybe the series had just run its course. Heck, the fourth entry was basically a bookend on Ogami's story along with all the characters he met along the way. Maybe it was just that time to let a good thing end and move on to something else. Or maybe it was time to be bolder than ever. Fast forward to July 2002, and a full-on 3D remake of the game that started it all was announced as a part of the Sakura Wars World Project. A project whose purpose was to revitalize interest in the series, bring sales right back up, and finally let the series wings spread in order to grace other regions. There were a few titles announced regarding this project, but one of the big boys was that remake titled Sakura Wars and Hot Blood. The Dreamcast titles did a lot of modernizing from the UI to the battle system, the latter of which is being developed with Overwork, so you know that's gotta be good. Along with a desire to beef up and polish the classic story that kicked off this whole chain of games in the first place, the opportunity wasn't seized in order to make a quick buck, but to honor one of Sega's most important recognizable games while rounding out the experience and updating it in an effort to improve what was already great in the first place. So with morale at an all-time high, a new chapter in the series just beyond the horizon, and this enhanced trip down memory lane finally released for fans and newcomers alike to enjoy, was the World Project a success? About that. Nearly half of the games announced for this project were canceled. None of the other games got a re-release of any kind on the PS2 as planned. And while the entire world did get the fifth entry in the series, that game was released in 2005. And the series only recently made a comeback in 2019. So no, it wasn't a success, but thanks for asking. A series of unfortunate events has made the bulk of Sakura Wars as a whole, even today, widely inaccessible, and it's a shame. After falling in love with a handful of its characters in Project Cross Zone, it's frustrating to have garnered so much interest in them when so much was keeping me away, but thankfully, I live in an era where fans have the power to take matters into their own hands. I can't express enough how exciting and meaningful it was to finally play the OG Sakura Wars for myself, and even upon replays, the game's quality only goes up while withstanding the tests of time. My stance remains unchanged. I love Sakura Wars. But is it the best way to experience that story? I mean, even if the World Project was a failure, that 3D remake still managed to be complete for the PS2, with the goal being for it to be so good that the original became obsolete. A high bar if I ever saw one, but one worth considering and discussing. So, let's consider and discuss it. Despite there not being an English translation for this remake in any way, shape, or form, I found that substantial knowledge of the game being remade, clear expressions permitting an understanding of every character's emotions at a glance, as well as some knowledge on my end since I've been studying a little Japanese behind the scenes, allowed me to confidently play through the entirety of this reprise. And after doing just that alongside a replay of the Saturn version, is this the definitive way to play Sakura Wars? In order to find that out, we're going to be going over the changes and compromises, the upgrades and downgrades, the good and the bad. We've got a very interesting game to talk about today, and one I haven't seen many people really discussing, so take a seat, grab some water, and get yourself comfortable. We're heading back into the Taisho era and rejoining the Flower Division within a whole new generation of gaming. This is Sakura Wars and Hot Blood. case it wasn't already clear, my video's purpose is to compare and contrast this modernization with its classic counterpart. If you're looking for a more in-depth look on the first game by itself along with my takes on the matter, I already gave it an entire review and I highly recommend giving that a look-see before continuing on with this one. For those who already have, or are ignoring my pleas for engagement, that's alright, I appreciate you sticking around for today's topic. Let's get into it. Updated visuals are one of the most important aspects for re-releases of any kind, and the Saturn version looked great despite the system's limitations. Does this game look any better? I'd say so for the most part. Some of the character sprites and new cut-in art felt a bit off. Sakura's eyes in particular look slightly too spaced apart, but they're very much overshadowed by the boatloads of new good ones. In fact, an immediate improvement right off the bat is the fact that characters have a longer list of sprites and expressions. Take a gander at this beautiful, long, girthy spectrum of emotions, which coupled with new full illustrations allows scenes to hit that much harder. I don't think the former game was particularly lacking when it came to the latter, and I kind of prefer how those look to these newer ones, more on that later, but I'm glad we have more for what that's worth. I'm also glad that in Sakura Wars 3 onward, we've ditched the framing and wallpaper background in favor of using the full screen. While I still find that look to be very charming and effective in its own manner, this is undoubtedly better and takes full advantage of the 4x3 space we have available. What a great aspect ratio, don't you agree? Just as great as this updated UI, which feels a lot cleaner and more distinct than how it was originally. The text boxes in particular have much more personality and brings the whole steam-powered aesthetic to a more noticeable level. It was always there, but so subdued in contrast to how loud and in your face it is now, which I vastly prefer. Something I can also say for how the combat portions in this game look. Remember the whole 3D part of this remake? Well, here it is. You know, outside of the whole fully rendered theater hub and chibi character models, which all look great by the way, maps have been brought to the third dimension along with the group's Kobu and enemies they'll encounter, and for the most part, everything looks great. Character models on the battlefield when it comes to the Hive of Darkness generals and random NPCs look pretty bad, but I'm willing to let that all slide considering you aren't forced to look at them for too long. The Kobu and Hex mechs were the ones that needed to look up to par, and I was very impressed all around. Your Kobu are so lively and animated remarkably well, coinciding with however the pilot's feeling or acting. This is something the series has been very consistent with, and I'm glad this game's no exception, especially compared to how it all looked on the Saturn. I have a peculiar fondness for the crunchy, pre-rendered look of those in combat sections, but outside of battle animations, they didn't have a lot of unique movement when it came to cutscenes and the like. It's nice to see them move about so freely this time around. It is probably the visual update I was impressed with the most. Something I was expecting to say about the game's anime cutscenes, but in an unfortunate twist of events, these kinda disappointed me. But let's start with the positives, because all it takes is a glimpse at the new intro movie to see that the series still don't miss when it comes to raw animation. Not only is the picture much cleaner than it was on the Saturn, but on top of this, they mastered a technique that allows for a seamless combination of animated and CG elements that blew me away, even with modern animation standards taken into consideration. Various scenes have been redone, so series veterans are bound to be shown classic moments and set pieces under a new coat of paint. And I was all on board at first, but like I said, these disappointed me, so let's get into that. There is an okay amount of scenes reanimated, but the majority of them are ones that get constantly reused over the course of many episodes. I was sort of expecting more one-off scenes to get the updated treatment, but instead, we front-loaded all the new stuff with most of them losing their impact and appeal because I got tired of seeing the same crap over and over again. I loved the updated Kobu moving out scene the first time I saw it, but after the third time onward, it seriously wore on me, which is a shame. There are quite a few one-off animated scenes, so I understand that it'd be a lot of work, but because all but one scene in the first episode received a facelift, you'd be forgiven for assuming that this would be the norm. It's not, by the way, I don't know if that was clear. Almost every scene reuses the older animation, now restored in a much cleaner picture quality, and you know what? I might have been a little cheesed at this early on, but upon reflection and kinda harkening back to me preferring the original game's full illustrations, my heart does still belong to those 90s animations. I like the new intro movie a lot more because of how involved it is compared to the Saturn's intro, which is fairly standard, but everything else in their style just works for me a lot more. And I mean, of course they do. I've always been impartial to vintage animation in the first place. I adore Studio Ghibli's classics. The few instances I watch anime are time spent viewing the likes of Sailor Moon and Cowboy Bebop, and I always find myself captivated by those lo-fi and feature funk compilations with various old school clips. I'm stuck in the past when it comes to this medium, meaning the remake's newer animations, no matter how good they ended up being, just wouldn't compare to these. So in a way, it should be good that there's more of the old than the new, but there's just one problem. Have you noticed something feels off about these? If so, you'd be correct, because they've been amateurishly zoomed in and cropped, so they haven't even been given a proper restoration. It's very noticeable if you played this game before, or maybe even saw them in a really cool review. I don't know, just throwing hypotheticals out there. But even for those who are experiencing this game as their introduction to the classic story, it's hard to miss the framing awkwardly needing to shift in order to follow the focal point. Not to mention, some scenes just look poorly framed as a result of this strange decision. Like this shot right here. It's meant to be framed in a way to make Maria look lonely on a somber, cold night, but in this remake, following a shot that was way too close on her face already, her placement is nearly in the dead center. Without even looking at how it's supposed to be presented, doesn't this just seem off? Rule of thirds, anyone? These scenes cutscenes were made with a wider aspect ratio than 4:3 in mind due to how the first game's UI was laid out. So did they crop and zoom into the picture in order to fill out the dead space that would have been there? If so, then that's funny because the intro video is letterboxed, a brand new scene animated to be displayed in this format. So if we were gonna break the rules for the first cutscene we watch upon starting the game, why make these older scenes the exception? What should have been, and in a way already was, the best looking part of the game ends up as a mess as a result of the inconsistencies and sloppy handling of the classic videos, which is a sad state of affairs, but hey, what can you do? Well, I mean, you can subscribe to Save for Revolution, but anyway. A few rough spots here or there, but I'd say that I was satisfied with this remake based on visuals alone. Granted, I don't hold graphics in too high regard, despite the occasional frame rate memeing, but I do find it important to have good music. I love the original game's soundtrack, and in Hot Blood did have me a little worried when I heard the instrumental to the main theme on the title screen. Seriously, does this sound cheap to anyone else, or is it just me? Thankfully, that does a poor job at representing the rest of the music, which was entirely re-recorded because just about all of it is an improvement on what was initially here. The only weak links, as a matter of fact, were the instrumentals of the main theme and Sumere's theme. Actually, on that note, characters still have the respective vocal themes, which remain a joy to listen to, but in the Saturn version, the instrumental variations of these songs were meant to double down as tracks that would play in each of their respective minigames. Some of these worked better than others. Koron's minigame instrumental for a main theme got the basic idea across, but characters like Sakura couldn't quite say the same since her vocal theme's a slower, lovely piece as opposed to a fast-paced minigame. And don't get me wrong, both songs sound great, but this game takes the opportunity to give characters instrumental themes that fall more in line with how they're, for lack of a better phrase, supposed to sound. Take our earlier example, Sakura for instance. This is her instrumental theme on the Saturn, and this is how it sounds in this remake. Absolutely beautiful. Every song I already enjoyed sounds better here, with other tracks I may not have been too big on getting that bump in quality. I was never crazy about the boss theme back on the Saturn. I thought it sounded a little corny, to be honest, but the updated instrumentation really helped it out and became one of my favorite songs in the game this time around. Here it is on the Saturn. And here it is on the PS2. Doesn't that just sound so much more imposing? Just about everything gets that type of improvement, which is saying a lot considering how much I already enjoyed how it all sounded in their earliest formats. And because of how much I enjoyed them back on the Saturn, I would still say that they have their place and that this new OST doesn't render them obsolete in any sense. And while we're on the topic of sound, let's talk about voice acting. There was a good amount of it, especially when taking the time of its release into consideration, and it all sounded great. That said, there were many unvoiced lines and even scenes that were partially voiced over, so I was hoping this remake would be used as an opportunity to fill in the holes. After all, the entire voice cast came back to reprise their roles, something that's super rare and worth taking advantage of. And yeah, there are a few new scenes which we'll get more into later, but to my surprise, next to none of the lines that weren't voiced remained silent in this re-release. To be fair, this is a game with tons of branching dialogue trees that house literally hundreds of lines of text. But considering that a bulk of the work was already done, not dubbing over at the very least previously silent lines feels like a missed opportunity, particularly with the scenes that dip in and out of voice acting. Could we not have at least ironed those ones out? Don't get me wrong, it's nice to hear a few additional lines of dialogue dubbed over, but let's make sure the ice cream tastes as great as possible before we start adding more sprinkles, despite how delicious those sprinkles may be. As you may know, in Hot Blood adds a ton of additional story elements, and every single one is really freaking good. Back in my review dedicated to the Saturn version, I said that every Flower Division member gets a chapter meant to flesh out and develop their character, but to be honest, that was sort of a half-truth. More specifically, Koron unfortunately got a bit shafted. Sakura and Sumire may be my top 2, but when taking a look at my full list, you'll notice that she rests comfortably at number 3. I love this girl, but I'll be the first to confess that I wouldn't have been opposed to her getting just a bit more time in the spotlight. She's introduced in the second chapter and gets a decent amount of screen time, but there's no real arc she goes through, and the chapter is simply more of an opportunity to get accustomed to the theater demon bashing life. In this version, however, an additional episode was added in order to flesh out Koron's character to the level she always deserved. Her struggle to fit in with the group was a little too subtle for its own good, but now her insecurities are on full display, which under normal circumstances would be a very bad thing, but here it allowed me to get to know her in a more obvious way. Not to mention gave the group more bonding time, which I'll always welcome with open arms. I truly love the Flower Division, and having more time with them in their premiere story was very welcome. Hell, even the side characters got a ton of love this time around, which which I wasn't expecting in the slightest. Yuri, Kasumi, and Tsubaki were pretty inconsequential in my Saturn playthroughs, which is totally fine. Sometimes the side characters are there to serve specific purposes in the story and nothing more, which is necessary. But even still, this time around, because there are so freaking many additional optional scenes, I was able to spend a lot of time with them and had a blast. It helps that you can raise and drop affection levels with these characters, giving them a lot more depth based on how they react to what you say, which goes double for Lieutenant General Yonaga and Ayame. The former is pretty tough to raise affection with, but that just speaks volumes for how strict and, frankly, good a leader he is for this troop. Trying to win his approval as Ogami was tough, but that challenge only made me want to do better in his eyes that much more. Sometimes I'd say or do something under the assumption that nobody was around, and then bam, he'd show up and react accordingly. Situations like these help to make scenarios feel all the more natural, and it's a big reason why I've fallen so hard for the series. As for Ayame, she's been fleshed out so much more than she was already, to the point where you can actually romance her this time around. I liked her a ton to begin with, but just like with everyone else, the extra scenes only made me appreciate her that much more. It's crazy how much was added in regards to dialogue and character development, failing to ruin the flow and pacing of the original game's presented narrative at that. Most of the new scenes are ones you'll come across during the story's free time segments, which are also more abundant in sections they really should have been in the first place. For example, in the chapter where you go on a mission with Sumire and Kana, you only get to relax for a second before heading out with the two of them. And even then, Sumire tells you not to keep her waiting for too long, so really you'll just end up talking to a few people before joining up with them. In contrast, this game makes you go on the mission with Sumire and Kana the following day, so you're given the night to chat with your teammates and see a few additional scenes. I loved the immediacy of the Saturn version, but the pros that come with In Hot Blood's added breathing room warrants the inclusion of it all and then some. It's simply more time to talk with these characters and get to know them on an even more intimate level than before. And with characters as great as these, you know I was down for that. In fact, I want to say all of them have little side stories to follow throughout the entirety of the game, but I don't know for sure because the game makes it impossible to see each event in every free time segment over the course of one playthrough. Did somebody say replay value? Oh, take me now! There's a staggering amount of content, but because it's impossible to see them all, you may find yourself like I did, coming across common plot threads to follow and get invested in. For my playthrough, I helped Sakura practice her stage performances, taught Iris how to play the piano, and did a little gardening with Kasumi among others. It was all great and made me curious as to what else there was to discover. Plus, hanging out with your favorites ends up being a great reliable method of getting their affinity levels high. You know I love my girl Sakura, so it was great to have her comfortably at the top of my affinity rankings. You know we only accept the best ending here at Zephyr Evolution. While talking about these free time events, though, we might as well go ahead and dive more into the gameplay changes because there's a lot to discuss. The lip system in particular has seen a few additions in between the first game and this remake, with said remake incorporating them all this time around, quite seamlessly at that. We've got time sequences, dialogue options changing partway through the timer, and analog lips where you can choose how forcefully Ogami will say a given phrase or in what way he goes about a specific action. I enjoy time sequences in the instances where your options change mid-lips timer, but I was never crazy over analog lips. Far too often, the best way to go about these is right in the middle, meaning whenever they pop up, you just need to hit the text advance option. And like, maybe they're meant for you to goof around in, but I gotta keep these trust levels high. I ain't got time to mess around. I'd prefer these if I were more encouraged to play around with them for better results, but far too often, the most reliable method was to interact with them as little as possible. This could have used a bit more tweaking, though I'm open to the series trying this again and doing it better. That being said, with these additional lips mechanics added onto or even baked into the classic tale, it's clear to see that the game leans much more into being a visual novel than an adventure game when outside of combat, something the series has actually been doing in more modern titles, so seeing that same philosophy brought here really helped to emphasize how good a decision this shift in direction was. Sakura Wars was always meant to fill in the adventure gap for the Saturn's library, but I believe this series excels much more as a visual novel and dating sim when it isn't being a strategy RPG. The adventure-focused portions tended to be some of the weaker parts of the game anyway, so seeing those sections more in line with how it would play out in a text-based title helped the gameplay that much smoother. The downside to this, however, is that minigames have been cut entirely, which is a shame. I really enjoyed their inclusion even if there weren't too many, and now the only one here is Koi Koi, which I don't particularly care for. Actually, now that I mention it, Koi Koi has been expanded upon from a game you play once with Koran to one you can now play a bunch of times with a bunch of characters. They keep bringing this back in a few titles, but I don't really get it and I'm bad at it, so I don't like it. Anyway, we were talking about the lack of minigames, which again is a bit of a downer. Now moments that used to be those games will either be a brief scene, a quick time event, or one of the new lips mechanics. That may sound like a downgrade to some of you, and it was to me for a while, but eventually I started to feel the same way towards them that I do with the adventure segments that got the same treatment. I don't know, man, I feel like this works better in the grand scheme of things. The gameplay loop ends up being a hell of a lot more consistent as a result of all of this. So if the price for this consistency is a lack of minigames, then you know what? I'm perfectly content with leaving them behind. In fact, why stop with the minigames? Throw out that old battle system too. We don't need it anymore. Because as much as I love the traditional grid structure, pressure. The third game introduced a new battle system future entries would utilize in order to help this series stand out among the crowd. One so good, as a matter of fact, that its spirit has been kept alive in a certain other popular Sega franchise. Its name here, however, is the ARMS battle system, and my dudes, this is easily my preferred gameplay style for the series. It is so good. A fact that shouldn't be too surprising, considering Overworks was the team behind it when they came on board for Sakura Wars 3. Chalk that up as another reason why they're one of my favorite parts of the company as a whole. How this combat works is that instead of moving tile by tile, you're able to walk for as much energy as you have in your gauge below relative to your starting position, meaning you can retract your steps if you find yourself going into a direction that's less beneficial than another without fear of losing all of your meter. After all, your meter is also how you'll do your other actions like attacking, none of which can be comboed up to 5 times, healing, defending, charging that special meter, and whipping out your special attack. It's an incredibly fluid approach to tactical gameplay that doesn't feel restrictive, yet still limits the player in thoughtful ways. It's nice to be able to adjust my positioning without fear of wasting energy, but the game also forces me to commit whenever I do an immediate action, thus balance is achieved. Various party members have the slightest differences to keep them distinct as well, while paving the way for multiple strategies. Kana is the only one who can hop over teammates, Iris can phase through objects, Maria attacks from a distance to snipe single targets, so on and so forth. You get it, and ideally, you love it. I know I do. I love constantly rewiring my brain to compensate for the different division members' playstyles, and forming strategies around their unique strengths, something the map design lends itself incredibly well to. They're simultaneously faithful to how they were once portrayed, while still feeling fresh to go around. Take the second map, for example. On the Saturn, it was very large in scale, as if you were climbing an actual mountain, but here it's a lot denser and more low-key, while harkening back to how it looked in the past. And I don't prefer one over the other, by the way. They're different, but work for their respective games. The ARMS battle system excels in more densely packed maps as opposed to sprawling battlefields, which I'm glad this game recognized when translating those levels for this newer release. And hey, every now and then, the map is designed to be entirely different in order to make a nice little change of pace. This map right here, for instance, was always one of my least favorites. It has a neat setup. Sakura and Ogami need to save the rest of their group trapped behind a locked door, but there's a lot of going back and forth just to open the right doors to progress. Go to this side to free your friends, go back the way you came to get in, then hit the button on the other side of that room in order to open the door to the boss, which was next to the first button. There's no real way to confidently optimize your movement, especially since your trapped friends start with low health. In this PS2 remake, on the other hand, the map has been changed entirely to a mini gauntlet on a timer. The group is still separated like before, but now Sakura and Ogami have to bust down the walls and enemies in their way while their team is trapped in a room full of poison. It's a lot shorter, but also a lot sweeter. I really enjoyed this one. I really enjoyed all the maps this time around. They're so tightly packed, which is one of the bigger reasons why ARMS combat is my preferred approach within this series. That said, I still wish there were more diverse map objectives like the example I just gave. Just about every other map is the same song and dance as before, kill all the guys. And that's too bad, because with gameplay like this, the enjoyment levels could go through the roof if there were other goals, like defending for a set amount of turns, or reaching the goal, or destroying specific targets. Not as exceptions to the norm, but being the norm in and of themselves. We're just shy of greatness, and I can only hope the team realized this and took action. Matter of fact, while we're on the negatives, I'll go ahead and get my biggest gameplay grievances out of the way because there are a few. Within ARMS combat as a whole, I've consistently found that my biggest issue is the turn order. Characters have their specific speed stats, those of which being simple to get a general idea for based on the character traits alone. The enemies, on the other hand, you never really know until you're in battle, and in all fairness, once you're on the map, nothing's stopping you from viewing the turn order. The problem, however, is that there have been a few instances where one or two of my party members got the crap beaten out of them before they could even move, which felt a little cheesy to me. I never had a party member die in this manner, but they teetered on the edge enough to where if I didn't heal, they were more or less a goner. And I think it would have been better to have a proper player and enemy phase just to make it so that if my character dies, it's as a result of poor strategizing on my end. I also think it would have been better to give me camera functionality on the right stick, because as it is, said camera's not great. You can only rotate it with the shoulder buttons, which didn't give me nearly enough control to get a decent view of the game's topography. No, there isn't even an option to view the map layout on your own. The best you've got is this auto-panning bird's eye view that gives you an okay idea, I suppose, but I would have rather had manual control. These are very easy fixes, so I'm not too concerned with, at the very least, one of these complaints being addressed, but nope, that's actually about it. In fact, I kinda wanna talk a little more about why combat's so good. I won't take up too much of your time. I'm sure by now you just wanna know if I like Sakura Wars' final mix more than its vanilla counterpart. But seriously guys, ARMS combat is so legit. A big reason as to why I fell so hard for the first game was because of how much was in service of the strategic gameplay. More so than I feel it gets credit. Everything from the lack of leveling up to the social sims weight on character stats made Sakura Wars as a whole constantly reward the player for being smart and tactical in how they present themselves and go about the actual actual maps. It was brilliant, and I'm happy to report that this game takes that strategic philosophy even further. Division members can now use team attacks with each other, and I'm not just talking about Ogami and another girl. The Division members themselves work together just as much as Ogami would with another character, if not more. It's almost like they have their own affinity levels with each other, even going so far as to have occasional conversations on the battlefield when you leave them next to one another, with the same being able to happen with Ogami as well. The social tactical blend bleeds into the combat, really validating my take on the original design mentalities while adding so many more layers to an already fulfilling combat system. Then on top of unique character traits, you can save your SP and do the full 5-hit combo, but instead of ending with a strong finishing blow, you can use another face button to debuff the enemy, raise your own stats, absorb HP, etc. It depends on which button you press for that specific character, which may seem like a lot, but really isn't all that bad. You have plenty of time to experiment, which I recommend doing because neglecting these isn't the smartest move you can make. Something I say because there's a pretty substantial difficulty curve here, never being too demanding of the player, but also never being a cakewalk. It obviously helps that there's no cheese strat like the ridiculously broken protection strat, but in regards to map layouts and enemy AI, I found myself genuinely challenged the further along things got. And it was awesome! I'm encouraged to use my tools. I need to be on my best behavior when chatting these girls up. I gotta be in the zone, and there's plenty for me to do when I am. This game is awesome! I loved Sakura Wars just fine on the Sega Saturn and didn't think it even needed a remake. But it has one, and it's great! It takes a lot of what made the OG so good in the first place while expanding on almost all of it. If anything, it replaces the battle system with a newer one that isn't just more unique, but also just better. I'm baffled that this game didn't sell nearly as well as it did back on the Saturn, especially considering that it's this good. But alas, another Sega title didn't sell well despite its overwhelming quality. Par for the course. I won't waste too much of your time whining about Sakura Wars' unfortunate fall from grace though, because we've still got one important question to answer. Is this PS2 remake the definitive way to experience the very first Sakura Wars tale? Language barrier aside, of course. You may be surprised to hear this, but I actually had a really tough time coming to a decision. The Saturn version's combat system, while not being my preference, does still hold up all things considered. And while the PS2 remake beefs up the content and extends that playtime in a satisfying way, the more streamlined, straight to the point nature of the OG has its own sense of appeal, lending itself even better to replays in an already replayable game. I mean, just ask yourself, would you sooner go back and run through a 15-hour game or a 25-hour one? I know I would pick the former, and Sakura Wars as a whole is one of those titles that begs you to come back and see what else it has to offer, considering it's impossible to experience it all in just one go. Then there's the whole situation regarding the ways these games look. Both provide that unique feeling of playing an anime, but I didn't emphasize that as much here like I did in my review of the Saturn version on its own, because I enjoyed that feeling more there. It goes back to me leaning far more in favor of vintage anime than the newer stuff. And yes, this game right here is obviously more old than new, but even still, the vibe of this game works so much better as a 90s anime. The writing, the drama, the setting, heck, the freaking characters. They all feel of a time where animated content from across the pond looked like this, felt like this. Every facet of that game worked together like a symphony, which in the end created an experience greater than the sum of its parts. In Hot Blood, on the other hand, fails to have that pathos and cohesion, which funnily enough, isn't just something I noticed in retrospect. I honestly felt this way during my replay of that original game while going through this remake at the same time. So even though there's so much I like in this remake more than I do in the classic iteration, I felt more captivated that first time around. With that in mind, can I really say that the PS2 version is the definitive experience? Can I really call it better? Yeah, I can, and I do. It's always a notable feat when a game can say that the end result is greater than the sum of its parts. That really says something about what you just played. But when another game's collective sum of its parts already reaches greater heights, that tends to not really matter, huh? This remake has better gameplay, retells the story in a more substantial manner, and truly remasters an already great collection of music. It may not have the superior animation, it may not have the runtime to lend itself better to replays, and heck, it may not have delivered on the same feelings as the Saturn original. But that's okay. The new animation looks amazing despite me getting sick of the same stuff as time went on. I wanted more of a good thing. And on the topic of replayability, its length may not be as appealing as it once was, but still, 25 hours ain't even all that bad. Not to mention, there's far more for me to find in this re-release as opposed to the original. It's debatably more replayable. Then as for the whole pathos angle, I think it's great that the original made me feel the way it did. That's such a special thing nobody or no thing will be able to take away from me. But that in and of itself shouldn't be the sole factor that teeters the scale in one direction over the other when the remake has all this other stuff going for it as well. Plus, it's not like In Hot Blood didn't make me feel anything. I still got that warmness in my heart getting to know these characters, especially in the new scenes that allowed for more glimpses at their true colors. I still felt like I was playing an anime, not a 90s one, but an early 2000s one, and I do love that era as well. What I ended up feeling here was great as well, to the point where if I could only play a single version of Sakura Wars 1, it'd be the release on the PS2. But that's just it. I don't have to only play a single version of this game. And this video kind of re-emphasizes why I don't find constant comparison to be a thing always needed in general game discussion. So what if I prefer In Hot Blood to the Saturn version? And I ain't even buy that much, and on top of this, my preference isn't as a result of any one game being of a lower quality level. Both are bangers, both are worth your time, and both blew me the hell away, solidifying me as a fan of this wonderful series. Don't just play one and not the other, they're each more than worth your time. Give them a whirl already. Odds are that if you're watching this video, you no doubt have the means to do so. Hell, even with the language barrier, it's not impossible to play through this game. And despite that generally requiring a bit more effort than usual, I promise you that it's worth it. The paramount story of the Flower Division is one that holds up today and deserves to be experienced by everyone, whether that be in its purest form or in Hot Blood, because either way, you're guaranteed to be in for an unquestionably great time. My stance remains unchanged. I love Sakura Wars. 舞台の